"Oh no," my daughter-in-law said with a bright smile as the grocery store clerk looked between us. "That old woman is the maid." For a moment, the entire checkout lane seemed to go quiet. The young clerk froze with a carton of eggs in her hands. The customer behind us lowered his phone. Even the woman bagging groceries stopped moving. I simply smiled. I nodded once, as if I hadn't heard anything unusual at all. But the truth is, that moment didn't begin in a grocery store. It began years earlier, with a promise I made to my late husband. My name is Margaret Bennett. I'm 68 years old, a widow, a mother, and a grandmother. At least, those were the roles I thought I still held in my family. That Tuesday morning had started like countless others. I woke up before sunrise in the small guest suite attached to my son Ryan's house. The room had once been called the in-law suite when the property was built. Over the years, however, it slowly became something else. A place where I slept between loads of laundry. A place where I kept my things while taking care of everyone else's. Outside my window, the Arizona sky glowed pink and gold. I made coffee and sat quietly at the little kitchen table. The house was still asleep. Those peaceful moments had become my favorite part of the day. They were the only moments that belonged entirely to me. By 7 o'clock, I was already preparing breakfast for my grandchildren. By 8, I was packing lunches. By 9, I was folding clothes left in baskets throughout the house. None of this bothered me. I loved my family. I loved being useful. What bothered me was something I couldn't quite name. A feeling that somewhere along the way, people had stopped seeing me. Not as a burden. Not even as a relative. Just invisible. Around noon, Olivia announced that she needed to stop by the grocery store. "Come with me," she said casually while scrolling through her phone. "I need help loading everything into the SUV." I agreed immediately. That's what I always did. We drove 15 minutes across town beneath a cloudless sky. Olivia spent most of the drive talking about an upcoming charity event she planned to attend. Designer, dresses, exclusive invitations, important people. I listened and smiled. She rarely asked questions about my life anymore. When Ryan was younger, he used to call every Sunday just to hear my voice. Now most conversations happened through Olivia. Somehow she always spoke for both of them. Inside the grocery store, Olivia pushed the cart while I followed with a shopping list. We moved through aisle after aisle collecting expensive cheeses, imported fruit, organic snacks, floral arrangements, sparkling water, and enough specialty ingredients to host a banquet. Every item went into the cart without hesitation. I noticed the total climbing long before we reached the registers. Nearly all of it would be paid through a household account connected to funds my husband and I had established years ago, an arrangement nobody discussed anymore. By the time we reached checkout, the cart was overflowing. The young cashier smiled warmly. She couldn't have been older than 22. "Did you find everything you needed today?" she asked. Olivia barely looked up from her phone. "I think so." The cashier glanced at me and smiled again. "That's good. It's always nice shopping with family." That was when Olivia laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not an awkward laugh. A genuine, amused laugh. "Oh no," she said. "That old woman is the maid." The words landed softly, almost playfully, yet somehow they felt heavier than anything she had ever said to me before. The cashier's smile disappeared instantly. Her eyes moved toward me. I could see confusion there. Embarrassment. Maybe even pity. I simply stood still. "She's been helping us forever," Olivia continued with a small shrug. "Honestly, I don't know what we'd do without her." The cashier didn't answer. Neither did I. I helped place groceries into bags. I folded the receipt. I thanked the clerk for her help. Then I pushed the cart toward the parking lot. Olivia seemed completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. Or perhaps she knew exactly what she'd done. The drive home felt longer than before. The desert landscape rolled past the windows in silence. Olivia hummed softly along with the radio. I watched the passing streets and thought about all the little moments I'd ignored over the years. The holiday cards where my name appeared at the bottom. The family photos where I somehow ended up standing at the edge. The birthday dinners where I spent more time serving food than eating it. Small things. Harmless things. At least that's what I told myself. But suddenly they no longer felt harmless. Back at the house, I carried grocery bags inside while Olivia disappeared upstairs to take a phone call. As I unloaded vegetables and canned goods, I found myself replaying those words again. That old woman is the maid. Not grandmother. Not mother-in-law. Not Margaret. The maid. I expected to feel angry. Instead, I felt strangely calm. The kind of calm that comes when a puzzle piece finally clicks into place. That evening, after dinner, I stepped outside onto the back patio. The air had cooled. A gentle breeze moved through the palm trees lining the property. I sat alone and watched the sunset paint the sky orange and purple. My late husband used to love sunsets. Pay attention, he would always tell me. The truth usually arrives quietly. For years, I hadn't understood what he meant. Sitting there with Olivia's words echoing in my mind, I began to wonder if perhaps the truth had been arriving for a very long time. Maybe I'd simply refused to see it. Inside the house, laughter drifted through the windows. Ryan had returned home. Olivia was telling a story. The grandchildren were watching television. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet something had changed. Not in them. In me. Because for the first time, I stopped asking whether I was imagining things. For the first time, I stopped making excuses for behavior that hurt. And for the first time, I began paying attention to details. Little details. The kind that eventually reveal everything. What I didn't know then was that a simple grocery receipt sitting quietly inside my purse would become the first clue. And before the week was over, I would discover that the woman who introduced me as the maid had been hiding something far more important than hurtful words. The next morning, I woke before dawn as usual. For a few seconds, lying in bed, beneath the soft glow of the digital clock, I felt almost peaceful. Then I remembered the receipt folded inside my purse. It was strange how such a small piece of paper could occupy so much space in my mind. I dressed quietly and made coffee while the rest of the house slept. The kitchen felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because I had started seeing things I had ignored before. The expensive espresso machine sitting on the counter. The imported marble backsplash Olivia insisted on installing last year. The custom cabinets Ryan claimed were necessary for resale value. Every improvement had a story attached to it. Every story seemed to end with money. As the coffee brewed, I opened my purse and unfolded the grocery receipt. The total was nearly $600. That alone was not surprising. What caught my attention was the payment information printed near the bottom. I read it twice, then a third time. The account used for payment carried a name I had not expected to see. Margaret Bennett Family Trust. My name. Not Ryan's. Not Olivia's. Mine. I stared at the receipt while the coffee cooled beside me. Years ago, shortly before my husband Thomas passed away, we created a family trust. He had always been careful with finances. Organized. Methodical. The type of man who kept records and labeled folders and balanced every statement by hand. After his death, Ryan assured me he would help manage everything. At the time, I had been overwhelmed with grief. Handling paperwork felt impossible. So I trusted my son. Why would I not? Yet seeing my own name printed there triggered something deep inside me. A question I should have asked years earlier. Exactly how much of our household spending was still connected to assets Thomas and I had built together. The thought stayed with me all morning. After breakfast, I drove the grandchildren to school. Then I returned home and began my usual routine. Laundry, dusting, organizing closets. Tasks that kept my hands busy while my mind wandered elsewhere. Around noon, Olivia left for lunch with friends. Ryan was at work. For the first time all day, the house was completely quiet. I carried a basket of folded towels upstairs and paused outside the home office. The door stood slightly open. Normally, I would have walked past without a second thought. Instead, I stopped. A filing cabinet sat against the far wall. Nothing remarkable, just a standard metal cabinet. Yet I remembered something Thomas used to say. The truth hides in ordinary places because nobody thinks to look there. I immediately felt guilty for even considering it. This was my son's office, his private space. But another voice whispered inside me. How many years had I spent respecting boundaries that nobody else seemed concerned about respecting? I stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of leather and printer paper. Family photos lined the shelves. Ryan's college graduation. Olivia holding their first child. Vacation pictures from places I had never been invited to visit. I looked through a few neatly stacked folders before convincing myself to stop. Then my eyes landed on a binder labeled household accounts. My heart began beating faster. I opened it carefully. Most of the information meant very little to me at first glance. Utility bills, property taxes, maintenance records. Then I saw it. Monthly transfers. Consistent. Regular. significant amounts moving from the family trust into household operating accounts. Month after month, year after year, I sat down slowly in Ryan's desk chair. Suddenly, pieces of the puzzle started shifting into place. The expensive groceries, the renovations, the vacations, the lifestyle. I was not looking at isolated expenses. I was looking at a pattern, a system, one that depended heavily on resources I had assumed were being preserved for the future. I closed the binder immediately when I heard a car door outside. My hands trembled as I returned everything exactly where I had found it. Moments later, Olivia walked through the front door carrying shopping bags. Her cheerful voice filled the hallway. "Margaret, would you mind helping me sort these?" she called. I answered yes automatically. Old habits are difficult to break. Together, we unpacked decorative items for the upcoming charity event. Crystal candle holders, custom invitations, designer table settings. Olivia chatted happily while I worked beside her. Not once did she ask whether I liked any of it. Not once did she seem curious about my opinion. At one point, she held up an elegant silver centerpiece. "This cost almost $800, she said proudly. "Can you believe that?" I smiled politely. $800. I thought about how carefully Thomas and I used to budget when Ryan was young. How many extra shifts Thomas worked so our son could attend college without crushing debt. How many weekends we spent repairing things instead of replacing them. The contrast felt impossible to ignore. Later that evening, after everyone finished dinner, I sat alone in the guest suite and opened an old photo album. Thomas smiled back at me from page after page. Younger, stronger, standing proudly beside the first home we purchased together, holding Ryan as a baby, grinning during camping trips and backyard barbecues. Looking at those photographs brought both comfort and sadness. Mostly, though, they brought clarity. Thomas never cared about wealth for its own sake. What mattered to him was responsibility, stewardship, respect, values he hoped Ryan would inherit. A memory surfaced suddenly. One conversation from years ago. We had been sitting on our back porch watching a summer storm roll across the horizon. Thomas had squeezed my hand and said, "If people ever start treating you differently because of what you own, pay attention. It tells you who they really are." At the time I laughed. Now those words felt painfully important. I closed the album and looked around the small room. For years I had accepted less space, less respect, less consideration. Not because anyone forced me to, because I convinced myself that keeping peace was the same thing as being loved. Yet peace built on silence is fragile. And for the first time in a very long time, I was beginning to suspect that everyone in this house knew far more about my finances than I did. The realization should have frightened me. Instead, it made me determined. Because if there was one thing I had learned from Thomas, it was this. The truth may arrive quietly, but once it arrives, it changes everything. The following morning, I decided to do something I had not done in years. I made an appointment at the bank. I did not tell Ryan. I did not tell Olivia. I simply got dressed, drove across town, and walked through the familiar glass doors of the branch where Thomas and I had managed our finances for nearly 3 decades. The building looked smaller than I remembered. Perhaps that happens when memories grow larger with time. A young receptionist greeted me warmly and asked how she could help. I explained that I wanted to review several trust accounts connected to my family's estate planning. Within minutes, I was seated in a quiet office across from a financial advisor named Daniel Harper. He could not have been older than 40, but he carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who understood numbers far better than people. After reviewing my identification, he opened the records. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Then his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not alarm, not concern, more like surprise. He looked back at the screen, then at me. "Mrs. Bennett," he said carefully, "how involved are you in managing these accounts?" I smiled politely. "Not very involved, I am afraid." That answer seemed to confirm something for him. He rotated the monitor slightly, so I could see. Columns of figures filled the screen. Transfers, withdrawals, recurring payments, investment activity. It was overwhelming. Yet one detail immediately stood out. The trust remained far larger than I had believed. Much larger. For years, I had assumed most of the assets had been distributed, spent, or allocated elsewhere. Instead, substantial resources remained under structures connected directly to my name. I sat quietly while Daniel explained the basics. The more he spoke, the more confused I became. I thought my son was handling everything. I admitted. He assists with certain administrative tasks, Daniel replied diplomatically. However, final authority on several accounts still belongs to you. I stared at him. To me? He nodded. Yes, ma'am. For a moment, I could only hear the soft hum of the office air conditioner. Final authority. The phrase echoed in my mind. For years, decisions had been presented to me as though they were already made. Renovations, transfers, expenses, investments. I had assumed I was merely being informed. Suddenly, I realized I might have been surrendering authority simply because nobody corrected that assumption. Daniel continued reviewing statements. Several transactions caught my attention immediately. Luxury purchases, travel expenses, event planning costs, large monthly household reimbursements. None of them were technically improper, yet they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. While I had been clipping coupons and repairing old sweaters, significant amounts of money had been quietly supporting a lifestyle far beyond basic family needs. The realization hurt more than I expected, not because of the money itself. Thomas and I worked hard so future generations could live comfortably. What hurt was understanding how little transparency existed, how casually everyone assumed I would never ask questions. When the meeting ended, Daniel handed me a folder containing updated records and contact information. As I stood to leave, he hesitated. Mrs. Bennett, may I offer one piece of advice? I nodded. Review everything personally. Sometimes families become accustomed to arrangements that continue long after the original intentions have changed. His words stayed with me all afternoon. On the drive home, I stopped at a small diner Thomas and I used to visit after church on Sundays. The place had barely changed. Same red booths, same black and white photographs on the walls, same smell of coffee and fresh pie. I ordered lunch and sat near the window. Around me, conversations drifted through the room. Retirees discussing golf, young parents managing energetic children, friends sharing stories over sandwiches, ordinary people living ordinary lives. For the first time in years, I felt strangely separated from my own routine, as though I had stepped outside a role I had been playing for too long. My phone buzzed. A message from Olivia. Can you pick up Emma from dance practice later? No greeting. No please. No question about where I was. Just an assumption. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Before replying, I have an appointment this afternoon. You may need to make other arrangements. Her response arrived almost instantly. What appointment? I smiled faintly. It was a simple question, yet somehow it felt significant. For years, nobody seemed interested in my schedule unless it affected theirs. Personal business, I replied. Nothing more. The silence that followed lasted the rest of the day. When I arrived home, the atmosphere felt different. Not hostile, just unsettled. Olivia seemed distracted during dinner. Ryan appeared unusually quiet. Several times I caught them exchanging brief glances across the table. Perhaps I imagined it. Perhaps not. After the meal, I carried my folder into the guest suite and locked the door behind me. Then I spread the documents across the table. Numbers filled page after page. I spent hours reading, learning, comparing dates. Slowly, patterns emerged. The family trust had become more than a safety net. It had become a foundation, one that supported expenses nobody ever discussed openly, one that everybody seemed to take for granted. Around 10 o'clock, I found a document that made me stop breathing for a moment. It was not a withdrawal, not an expense report, not an investment summary. It was a proposal, a preliminary financial plan prepared several months earlier. Most of it was routine, property maintenance, tax considerations, long-term projections. Then I noticed a section discussing future housing arrangements. My eyes moved slowly across the page. There, buried among technical language, was a recommendation suggesting that I eventually transition into a senior living community while portions of the estate could be restructured for household efficiency. Household efficiency. Such harmless words. Yet the meaning beneath them felt unmistakable. I sat back in my chair and stared at the wall. Nobody had ever discussed such plans with me. Nobody had asked what I wanted. Nobody had mentioned that conversations about my future were already taking place. Outside, the house grew quiet as everyone prepared for bed. I remained awake long after midnight. Not angry, not frightened, just awake. For years, I believed I understood my place within this family. That certainty was gone now. In its place stood something far more powerful. Awareness. And once awareness arrives, it becomes impossible to return to ignorance. The next few days passed with an odd sense of calm. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still woke before sunrise. I still packed lunches, folded laundry, and drove the grandchildren wherever they needed to go. Olivia still moved through the house with effortless confidence. Ryan still disappeared into work meetings and conference calls. Yet beneath the surface, everything felt different because I was finally paying attention. Once you begin noticing patterns, they become impossible to ignore. On Thursday afternoon, I attended Emma's school music recital. I arrived 20 minutes early and found a seat near the front. Parents slowly filled the auditorium carrying flowers, cameras, and cups of coffee. The room buzzed with excitement. A few minutes before the performance began, Olivia arrived with Ryan. They spotted several friends and immediately joined a conversation near the aisle. I watched them laugh and greet people. Then something familiar happened. Introductions began. Names were exchanged. Children were proudly presented. Spouses were acknowledged. I sat less than 30 feet away. Yet nobody gestured toward me. Nobody said, "This is Ryan's mother." Nobody included me in the conversation. It was a small thing. So small that most people would never notice. But I noticed. Because it was not the first time. Suddenly memories started returning one after another. The charity banquet where I spent 3 hours helping prepare decorations only to be seated at a table near the kitchen entrance. The neighborhood holiday party where Olivia introduced me as family help in a tone that sounded playful enough to avoid criticism. The vacation photographs displayed throughout the house that somehow never included me despite the fact that I had stayed behind to care for pets, collect mail, and keep everything running while everyone else traveled. None of those moments had seemed important individually. Together, they formed a picture I could no longer deny. After the recital ended, Emma ran toward me carrying a handmade program. Her smile instantly brightened my mood. "Grandma, did you hear my solo?" she asked. "Every note," I told her truthfully. She wrapped her arms around me and held on tightly. Children often see things adults overlook. Emma never treated me like an obligation. To her, I was simply grandma. For a brief moment, I wondered whether that simple truth was exactly what Olivia disliked. That evening, after dinner, I found myself standing in front of an old storage cabinet located in the garage. Most people probably forgot it existed. Years earlier, Thomas had stored personal records there before everything was digitized. Dust covered the top shelf. Several boxes remained unopened for years. I spent nearly 2 hours sorting through documents, photographs, and old household records. Most of it was ordinary family history. Then I discovered a sealed envelope bearing Thomas's handwriting. My heart immediately tightened. He had beautiful handwriting, precise and careful. Even after all these years, seeing it felt like hearing his voice. The envelope contained several pages. Some were personal notes. Others related to estate planning. One paragraph caught my attention instantly. Thomas described his desire to ensure that I always maintained independence and decision-making authority regardless of future circumstances. He emphasized that financial convenience should never override personal dignity. I read those words 3 times. Financial convenience. The exact phrase I had seen in the proposal discussing future housing arrangements. A chill moved through me. Thomas had anticipated this possibility years ago. Not because he distrusted Ryan, but because he understood human nature. People become comfortable, then entitled, then convinced they deserve things that were never truly theirs. I placed the papers back into the envelope and sat quietly in the garage for a long time. Outside, the Arizona evening settled across the neighborhood. Porch lights flickered on one by one. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet I felt as though I had uncovered the first chapter of a story nobody expected me to read. The following morning brought another unexpected development. While dropping Emma off at school, I stopped for coffee at a small cafe across the street. As I waited in line, a familiar voice called my name. I turned and immediately recognized Richard Lawson. He had been one of Thomas's closest friends for nearly 20 years. Age had added gray hair and deeper lines around his eyes, but his warm smile remained unchanged. We sat together for almost an hour. Conversation flowed naturally from old memories to current events. Eventually, he asked how I was adjusting after Thomas's passing. I answered honestly, better than before, but still learning. Then he asked a question that surprised me. "Are you still involved with the foundation?" I frowned slightly. "What foundation?" His expression changed instantly. "The Bennett Community Fund." I stared at him. The name sounded familiar, yet distant. Richard looked confused. Thomas helped establish it years ago. He always said you would eventually oversee everything. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Another piece of the puzzle had appeared. Another responsibility connected to my name that nobody had mentioned in years. Richard explained that the fund still existed and continued supporting local educational programs. Several trustees remained active. Meetings were held regularly. Updates were distributed. Somehow, despite being listed among the founding parties, I had received almost no information. As I drove home afterward, my thoughts raced. The trust accounts, the housing proposal, the forgotten foundation. Each discovery revealed the same unsettling pattern. Important information existed just beyond my view. Not hidden exactly, simply never shared. By the time I pulled into the driveway, a new realization had settled firmly into place. For years, I believed I had gradually stepped back from responsibility because that was what aging required. Now I was beginning to suspect something very different. Perhaps I had not stepped back at all. Perhaps other people had quietly stepped forward and occupied spaces they assumed I would never reclaim. That weekend, the annual charity gala finally arrived. Olivia had spent months preparing for it. Every conversation seemed to circle back to seating charts, sponsors, decorations, and guest lists. By Saturday afternoon, the house looked like a staging area for a major event. Garment bags hung from doors. Boxes of printed materials lined the hallway. Florists delivered arrangements throughout the morning. I quietly helped where I could, carrying supplies, organizing paperwork, and handling dozens of small tasks that nobody noticed until they were completed. Around 4 o'clock, Olivia appeared in the kitchen wearing an elegant navy dress and carefully arranged jewelry. She looked pleased with herself. "Everything is finally coming together," she announced while checking messages on her phone. "This event could open a lot of doors." I smiled politely. "I am sure it will be wonderful." She barely looked up. "I hope so. Important people will be there." Important people. The phrase lingered in my thoughts long after she left the room. Over the past several weeks, I had started noticing how often status entered her conversations. Important people. Important invitations. Important opportunities. Somehow kindness, loyalty, and gratitude never seemed to make the list. Later that evening, I arrived at the gala separately. I wanted time to observe before joining the crowd. The ballroom occupied the top floor of an upscale hotel overlooking downtown Phoenix. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished floors. Round tables stretched across the room beneath elegant centerpieces. Guests mingled while waiters moved gracefully between conversations. Everything appeared impressive. Yet what caught my attention was not the decor. It was a display positioned near the entrance. Several large presentation boards highlighted community projects funded through charitable contributions. One banner immediately stopped me in my tracks. Bennett Community Fund. My eyes remained fixed on the name. The same organization Richard had mentioned days earlier. Photographs covered the display. Scholarship recipients. Community programs. Educational initiatives. Beneath one photograph appeared a list of founding supporters. Thomas Bennett. Margaret Bennett. I stood perfectly still. Dozens of people passed around me without noticing. For years, I had heard almost nothing about this foundation. Yet here it stood in plain sight, actively supporting projects throughout the region. A gentleman wearing a trustee badge approached with a warm smile. "Mrs. Bennett?" he asked. I looked at him in surprise. "Yes." His face brightened instantly. "I cannot believe it is really you. We have hoped you might attend one of these events someday." Before I could respond, 2 additional trustees joined us. They greeted me warmly and spoke with genuine affection about Thomas. More surprising still, they spoke about me as though I were still an active part of the organization. One trustee explained that several attempts had been made over the years to contact me regarding board updates and annual meetings. I listened carefully. "Contact me?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. "Letters, invitations, reports. We assumed your family passed everything along." A quiet silence settled over our conversation. Nobody said anything directly. Nobody needed to. The implication hung between us. If correspondence had been sent, it never reached me. For the second time that week, I discovered another stream of information diverted somewhere before arriving in my hands. The evening continued. I met educators, donors, and community leaders. Many remembered Thomas fondly. Several remembered me as well. To my surprise, they treated me with respect. Genuine respect. Not because of money. Not because of status. Because they believed I had helped build something meaningful. The feeling was almost unfamiliar. As the program began, guests found their seats. I noticed Olivia positioned near the front alongside local business leaders and sponsors. She looked confident and perfectly at ease. Then an unexpected announcement changed the atmosphere entirely. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone. After thanking sponsors and volunteers, he introduced several individuals connected to the foundation's history. Suddenly, I heard my own name. Tonight, we are honored to recognize one of the original founding families whose vision helped establish opportunities that continue benefiting students across Arizona. Hundreds of faces turned toward my table. For a brief moment, I simply sat there. Then polite applause filled the ballroom. Across the room, I saw Olivia's expression freeze. Ryan looked equally surprised. The master of ceremonies continued speaking about Thomas and the foundation's beginnings. Then he invited me to stand. My knees felt slightly weak as I rose. More applause followed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing overwhelming. Yet the moment carried unexpected weight. Because for years I had slowly disappeared inside my own life. And now, surrounded by strangers, I was being acknowledged more sincerely than I had been inside my own home. After the presentation ended, several guests approached to introduce themselves. One conversation led to another. People asked questions, shared memories, discussed future projects. Throughout it all, I noticed something interesting. Olivia spent much of the evening watching from a distance. Not hostile, not angry, simply unsettled. As though she had suddenly discovered information she never expected others to know. When the gala finally concluded, I walked toward the exit feeling strangely peaceful. Outside, the desert night air felt cool against my skin. The city lights stretched across the horizon. Behind me, laughter and conversation continued as guests departed. My phone buzzed with a message. It came from one of the trustees I had met earlier. Mrs. Bennett, we would love to discuss your future involvement with the foundation. There are several matters that require your approval. I stared at the message for several seconds. Your approval. Once again, those words appeared. Authority. Approval. Responsibility. Roles I thought I had surrendered long ago. Slowly, I slipped the phone back into my purse and looked out across the city. For years, other people had been deciding who I was. A helpful grandmother. A convenient caretaker. An invisible presence in the background. Yet piece by piece, a different picture was emerging. And for the first time, I began to suspect that the most important chapters of my story had not already passed. They were only beginning. Monday morning arrived with an unusual sense of anticipation. For the first time in years, I was not waiting for someone else's plans to determine my day. I had plans of my own. Shortly after breakfast, I drove to the offices of the Bennett Community Fund. The building occupied a modest corner property near downtown. Nothing extravagant. Just a well-maintained brick structure surrounded by flowering shrubs and shaded walkways. As I stepped through the front doors, several staff members greeted me warmly. Their reaction surprised me. People smiled. They knew my name. One young woman even thanked me for helping establish scholarship programs that had changed students' lives. I smiled politely, though inside I felt embarrassed because I had done so little in recent years. Or at least I thought I had. A trustee named Harold escorted me into a conference room where several board members were already gathered. Coffee cups sat beside neatly organized folders. As the meeting began, I quickly realized something important. The foundation was thriving. Dozens of scholarships had been awarded. Community projects continued expanding. Financial reports showed healthy growth. Yet another detail captured my attention. Several board decisions requiring founder approval had been delayed for years because nobody could reach me directly. Correspondence had been mailed. Invitations had been sent. Updates had been distributed. Somehow very little had ever reached my hands. I listened carefully while the board reviewed upcoming initiatives. Then Harold slid a folder toward me. There is one additional matter, he said. Inside was a document listing current authorized contacts connected to various administrative records. My eyes moved slowly down the page. There, besides several communication categories, appeared a familiar email address. Olivia's. For a moment, the room seemed unusually quiet. Nobody noticed my reaction. They simply continued discussing procedures. Yet inside, Another piece of the puzzle settled into place. Information had not merely disappeared. In some cases, it had been redirected. By the end of the meeting, I had updated every contact record. Personally, my mailing address, my phone number, my email, direct communication, no intermediaries. As I signed the final form, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. Not victory, relief. Like opening curtains in a room that had remained dark too long. When I returned home that afternoon, I found Olivia sitting at the kitchen island scrolling through her tablet. She looked up briefly. "How was your day?" she asked. The question sounded casual, but it caught me off guard. She rarely asked. "Productive," I replied. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Doing what?" I poured myself a glass of water before answering. "Meeting with people connected to the foundation." For the first time in weeks, genuine surprise crossed her face. It disappeared almost instantly, replaced by a practiced smile. "Oh, that foundation." I nodded. "Yes, that foundation." Neither of us said anything else. Yet the silence carried weight. Later that evening, after dinner, I sat on the back patio watching the sunset. Ryan joined me unexpectedly. He looked tired, older somehow. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he lowered himself into the chair beside mine. "Mom," he said quietly, "have you been reviewing financial documents lately?" The question did not surprise me. I had been expecting it. "Yes," I answered honestly. He stared toward the horizon. "Why?" I thought carefully before responding. "Because they belong to me too." The words hung between us. Ryan looked down at his hands. For a brief moment, I saw the young man Thomas and I raised. Not the executive, not the homeowner, just my son. "Nobody was trying to hurt you," he said softly. I believed he meant it. That was the tragedy of situations like this. Harm does not always begin with cruelty. Sometimes it begins with convenience, then assumptions, then entitlement. By the time people notice the damage, they can no longer see where it started. "I know," I replied. "But sometimes people stop asking what is fair when they become comfortable with what is easy." Ryan did not answer. The evening breeze moved through the trees surrounding the yard. Somewhere inside the house, Emma laughed at something on television. Life continued exactly as before. Yet beneath the familiar routines, something important had shifted. For the first time, questions were being asked. And for the first time, I was no longer afraid of the answers. Over the next week, a subtle tension settled over the house. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. Yet conversations became more careful. Doors closed more often. Phone calls ended when I entered a room. It was the kind of change most people would miss. But once you spend years paying attention to everyone else's needs, you learn how to notice even the smallest shifts. One Wednesday afternoon, I returned from a foundation meeting and found Olivia hosting several friends in the living room. Elegant trays of pastries covered the coffee table. Laughter drifted through the house. I considered slipping quietly into the guest suite, but Emma spotted me first. "Grandma is home," she announced happily. Several women turned toward me. Most smiled politely. One introduced herself and complimented my scarf. Before I could answer, Olivia laughed lightly and said, "Margaret keeps busy. I do not know what we would do without her around here." The words sounded harmless on the surface. Everyone nodded. The conversation moved forward. Yet I noticed something important. Olivia did not introduce me as family. Not as Ryan's mother. Not as Emma's grandmother. Simply as someone who was useful. Once, I would have ignored the distinction. Now I heard it clearly. Later that evening, after her guests left, I carried empty serving trays into the kitchen. Olivia stood at the counter reviewing notes for another charity project. "Your friends seem nice," I said. "They are well connected," she replied immediately. I smiled faintly. Again, connections. Status. Influence. The same themes appeared over and over. Then she surprised me. "Actually, there is something I wanted to discuss." Her tone changed slightly, more cautious than usual. She opened a folder and slid several pages across the counter. "Some advisors have been reviewing long-term planning options. Nothing urgent, just ideas." I glanced at the documents. Housing projections, property management recommendations, financial forecasts. Familiar. Language. Very familiar. My eyes paused on a section discussing future transitions for senior family members. There it was again. Different wording. Same destination. I closed the folder gently. "Interesting," I said. Olivia studied my face. "You are not upset?" "Should I be?" She looked away first. "Of course not. We are only planning ahead. Planning ahead. The phrase lingered in my mind long after the conversation ended. The next morning, I met Harold and two trustees for breakfast. During the meeting, they reviewed several foundation initiatives requiring founder authorization. The discussion remained productive until Harold mentioned a pending expansion project. We delayed moving forward because we never received your response, he explained. My response? I asked. He nodded. The proposal was sent nearly 18 months ago. 18 months. Another document I had never seen. Another decision waiting for approval that nobody thought to mention directly. This time, however, something else caught my attention. The original communication log showed confirmation that the message had been delivered electronically to an address associated with family administration records. An address controlled by Olivia. Nobody said anything accusatory. Nobody needed to. The facts spoke for themselves. On the drive home, I felt neither angry nor shocked. Strangely, I felt relieved. Each discovery removed another layer of uncertainty. The truth was becoming easier to see. Not because anyone confessed, because patterns rarely stay hidden forever. That evening, Ryan knocked on my door. He looked exhausted. The confident executive I usually saw seemed absent. Instead, he looked like a man carrying too many responsibilities. Can we talk? He asked. We sat together at the small table in my suite. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan exhaled slowly. Mom, I think things have gotten more complicated than they should have. It was the closest thing to an admission I had heard. Complicated how? I asked gently. He rubbed his forehead. There were assumptions. Decisions made because everyone thought they were helping. Helping. Another familiar word. I nodded. Sometimes helping begins with good intentions. Ryan looked down. And sometimes people stop asking permission because they convince themselves the answer will be yes. Silence filled the room. Ryan did not argue. That told me more than any explanation could have. Before leaving, he paused at the door. You know I love you, right? The question broke my heart a little. Not because I doubted it. Because I knew he was finally questioning whether his actions reflected it. I know, I said softly. Love is not the issue. After he left, I sat alone for a long time. Outside, lights glowed across the backyard. Emma's laughter floated through an open window. Somewhere in the house, Olivia moved from room to room preparing for another event. Life continued, yet a turning point had arrived. For years, everyone assumed I would remain quiet, that I would accept information only when it was offered, that I would continue living inside decisions made by other people. Those assumptions were beginning to crumble. And although nobody realized it yet, a much larger conversation was approaching. One that would force every member of the family to decide whether they valued convenience more than honesty. The following Friday, Olivia announced that she was hosting a special dinner at the house. She described it as a celebration of family, community involvement, and future opportunities. The guest list included business associates, foundation donors, neighbors, and several people Ryan hoped to impress professionally. From the moment breakfast ended, preparations consumed the entire household. Caterers arrived carrying trays and equipment. Fresh floral arrangements appeared in nearly every room. The dining table was extended to its full length and covered with elegant place settings. Throughout the day, I watched everything unfold with quiet interest. What fascinated me most was not the event itself. It was the timing. During the previous several weeks, questions had started surfacing. Documents had been reviewed. Contact records had been corrected. Conversations that had been avoided for years were finally taking place. Yet instead of addressing any of it directly, Olivia seemed determined to create a carefully controlled picture of success. By late afternoon, guests began arriving. Luxury vehicles lined the street outside. Laughter and conversation quickly filled the house. I dressed simply in a navy blue blouse Thomas had always liked and joined the gathering shortly before dinner. As I entered the living room, several people greeted me warmly. Some recognized me from the gala. Others knew me through foundation work. Their kindness contrasted sharply with the role I had occupied inside this house for so long. One donor asked my opinion about a scholarship initiative. Another wanted to discuss community partnerships. Each conversation felt natural, respectful, genuine. Across the room, I noticed Olivia watching. Her smile never disappeared, but something behind it seemed strained. During cocktails, I overheard fragments of conversation. Guests praised the foundation's recent accomplishments. Several mentioned future projects requiring founder approval. More than once, someone directed questions toward me rather than Olivia. Each time, she redirected the discussion with practiced efficiency. Yet the pattern continued. People wanted to hear from me. Not because I was wealthy, not because I held authority, because they believed I mattered. As dinner approached, everyone moved into the dining room. Name cards marked each seat. I glanced at the arrangement and almost smiled. My place setting sat near the far end of the table, positioned away from most key guests. Years ago, I would have accepted the placement without a second thought. This time, however, something unexpected happened. Harold, one of the foundation trustees, arrived moments before seating began. Spotting me immediately, he crossed the room with a warm expression. "Margaret," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "there you are. We saved a seat for you closer to the center. Several board members hope to speak with you tonight." Before anyone could object, he exchanged my place card with another guest's. The adjustment appeared innocent, practical, yet I noticed Olivia's posture stiffen ever so slightly. Throughout dinner, conversations flowed easily. Education programs, community projects, local businesses, future plans. Again and again, questions returned to foundation matters. Again and again, people looked toward me for input. Ryan remained unusually quiet. Several times our eyes met across the table. There was no anger in his expression, only reflection, perhaps even regret. Halfway through the meal, one guest congratulated Olivia on her leadership. She accepted the compliment gracefully and began describing years of charitable involvement. As she spoke, another donor interrupted politely. Of course, none of this would have been possible without the Bennett family legacy. Margaret and Thomas created something remarkable. The room fell briefly silent. Not awkwardly, simply because the comment redirected attention. For the first time all evening, nobody rushed to change the subject. Several guests nodded in agreement. One woman described how a scholarship had transformed her niece's future. Another praised the foundation's consistency over the years. Listening quietly, I felt something unexpected. Not pride. Gratitude. Gratitude that Thomas's efforts still mattered. Gratitude that some people remembered the values behind the work. After dessert, guests moved into smaller groups throughout the house. Conversations continued over coffee and tea. Near the fireplace, I found myself speaking with a retired attorney who specialized in nonprofit governance. During our discussion, he casually mentioned an upcoming review involving founder participation and long-term oversight structures. "Your involvement will be important," he said. "Several decisions cannot move forward without your direct authorization." The statement was simple, matter of fact. Yet I noticed Olivia freeze across the room while arranging empty glasses. The attorney continued speaking, completely unaware of the effect his words had produced. Later that evening, as guests prepared to leave, Harold approached with a sealed envelope. "I wanted to give this to you personally," he said. "We have been trying to schedule a formal review for months." I accepted the envelope and slipped it into my purse. Olivia watched the exchange carefully. So did Ryan. Neither said a word. By 10 o'clock, the last guests had departed. The house finally grew quiet. Caterers packed equipment. Lights dimmed. Chairs were returned to their places. I helped clear a few remaining dishes before carrying my purse back to the guest suite. Once inside, I closed the door and sat at the small table near the window. Then I opened the envelope. Inside were several documents outlining governance updates, asset oversight responsibilities, and founder authority provisions. Near the bottom of one page appeared a date. A formal review meeting had been scheduled for the following week. Attendance was required. Founder approval would determine the future direction of several major initiatives. I read the page slowly. Then I read it again. Outside, the house remained peaceful. Yet I understood something important. For years, people assumed my role would continue shrinking until it disappeared entirely. They believed decisions could be made around me rather than with me. That assumption was about to face its greatest test. And for the first time since Thomas passed away, I felt completely prepared for whatever came next. The review meeting took place the following Thursday morning. Unlike the elegant charity dinners and social events that filled so much of Olivia's calendar, this gathering was quiet and professional. It was held in a conference room at the foundation headquarters. Large windows overlooked downtown Phoenix. Folders rested neatly at every seat. Coffee steamed from insulated carafes near the side table. Everything felt calm. Organized. Serious. I arrived 15 minutes early carrying only my purse and the documents I had reviewed throughout the previous week. Harold greeted me warmly. Several trustees shook my hand. A few staff members introduced themselves. For the first time in many years, I walked into a room where people expected my participation rather than my assistance. Ryan arrived shortly afterward. He looked nervous. Olivia followed beside him, perfectly dressed and carefully composed. She smiled politely at everyone, yet something about her expression felt different, less confident than usual. Perhaps she understood that this was not a social gathering. This was a room filled with records, responsibilities, and facts. Once everyone settled into their seats, the meeting began. Reports were presented. Financial summaries were reviewed. Scholarship outcomes were discussed. Future initiatives were outlined. I listened carefully, asking questions when necessary. Several trustees seemed pleasantly surprised by how familiar I was becoming with the foundation's operations. The truth was simple. Once information finally reached me directly, understanding it became much easier. Nearly 2 hours passed before the conversation shifted toward governance matters. Harold opened a folder and addressed the room. Before we move forward with the next phase of expansion, several founder-related issues must be resolved. The atmosphere changed immediately. Not dramatically, just enough for everyone to recognize the importance of the discussion. Documents were distributed. Historical records appeared on presentation screens. Communication logs were reviewed. Then the pattern I had been discovering for weeks became visible to everyone at once. Numerous invitations had gone unanswered. Multiple approvals had remained pending. Important correspondence had repeatedly failed to reach me despite being sent through designated channels. Nobody accused anyone of wrongdoing. Nobody raised their voice. The facts simply existed. Quiet, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. One trustee summarized the situation carefully. It appears founder communications were frequently routed through third parties rather than delivered directly. Several people nodded. Ryan stared down at the table. Olivia remained perfectly still. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Harold looked toward me. Mrs. Bennett, moving forward, how would you like these responsibilities handled? It was such a simple question, yet hearing it felt strangely emotional. For years, people had made assumptions about what I wanted, what I needed, what was best for me. Very few had actually asked. I took a slow breath before answering. Directly, I said, I would like all communications, decisions, and approvals delivered directly to me. Harold smiled. That can certainly be arranged. The matter could have ended there. But another trustee spoke up. There is one additional issue. He opened a file containing founder authority provisions established by Thomas years earlier. Several clauses were reviewed. Oversight authority, approval rights, governance participation, financial protections. By the time the presentation concluded, everyone in the room understood something important. The role Thomas created for me had never disappeared. It had simply been ignored. Not legally, not formally, socially, quietly, conveniently. The distinction mattered, because recovering authority did not require conflict. It required participation. When the meeting adjourned, people began gathering their materials. Conversations resumed. Chairs moved. Coffee cups emptied. Yet I remained seated for a moment, absorbing everything that had happened. Across the room, Ryan approached slowly. He looked tired, older than I had ever seen him. Mom, he said quietly, can we talk? We stepped outside onto a shaded terrace overlooking the city. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ryan exhaled heavily. I should have paid more attention. There was no defensiveness in his voice. No excuses. Just honesty. Maybe, I replied gently. He looked away toward the skyline. I kept telling myself everyone was helping, that everything was working. I nodded. Sometimes things work for a long time before anyone notices the cost. Ryan's eyes filled with regret. I never wanted you to feel unimportant. The words hurt because I believed him. He had not set out to hurt me. Somewhere along the way, however, convenience replaced awareness. Assumptions replaced conversations. And silence filled the spaces where respect should have lived. I know, I said softly. But intentions matter less than actions when years begin adding up. Behind us, the conference room doors opened. Olivia stepped onto the terrace. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed uncertain. Not angry, not arrogant, simply uncertain. She approached slowly. Margaret, she began, then stopped. I waited patiently. Eventually, she tried again. There are things I should have handled differently. It was not a dramatic apology. It was not perfect. Yet it was probably the most honest sentence she had spoken to me in years. I nodded once. Yes, I said. There are. None of us spoke for several seconds. The silence felt different from the silences of the past. This one was not built on avoidance. It was built on recognition. As we stood there overlooking the city, I thought back to that afternoon in the grocery store, to the cashier's expression, to the careless introduction that had reduced an entire life to a role of convenience. Strangely, I no longer felt anger about it, because that moment had given me something valuable. It forced me to see what had been happening all along. More importantly, it forced me to see myself clearly. I was not invisible. I was not an afterthought. I was not someone waiting quietly at the edge of other people's lives. I was Margaret Bennett. I was Thomas Bennett's partner. I was a mother, a grandmother, a founder, a decision-maker, a woman whose voice still carried weight. The weeks that followed brought changes both large and small. Foundation communications arrived directly to me. I accepted a more active advisory role. Ryan and I began rebuilding our relationship through honest conversations rather than assumptions. Even Olivia changed. Not overnight. Real change rarely happens that way. But gradually, consistently, respect returned to places where convenience had once lived. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Dignity is not something other people give you. It is something you remember. The moment you remember it, everything else begins to change.